quite ready.
Okay, we're on.
Ready? Okay, hi. I'm Tom Schweich, State Auditor. I really appreciate your taking the time to come here tonight. We're going to deliver the results of the City of Warrenton audit. I have with me here Spence Jackson from my office, who works on media. Bobby Showers at the back there is the audit manager who really ran this audit, and Heather Stiles is here too, who was the auditor in charge. What I'm going to do tonight, the structure of the meeting is I'm going to go over the history of the audit and why we did it. I'm going to go over the specific findings of the audit, what we found, and the corrective action that we're recommending. And then I'm going to open it up for a few questions. I would ask that the questions be of general interest to all the people here. I'm always happy to talk to people through our www.auditor.mo.gov website, too, about individual issues that you may have. This is a petition audit, and the reason I'm here tonight is I think petition audits are the most important audits that we do. It's really a situation where citizens have taken matters into their own hands. They've taken the time to get the requisite number of signatures, and then we do the audit by law. Of the audits that we do in a given year, I'll do maybe 150 audits, and somewhere between 20 and 30 will be petition audits. So I always put those at the top of the pile, though, because if you, the citizens, have taken the time to ask me to do the audit, they go to the top of the line rather than to the bottom, because I think it's so important, because it is democracy at work. In this particular case, in order to get us to do the audit, 15% of the 3,171 people who voted in the last governor's election had to sign a petition. That would have been 476 signatures needed, and we got 553 signatures. So this was valid as a petition audit at that point. We audit generally one fiscal year. In this case, it was the fiscal year ending 2012. We do sometimes reach back if an issue goes further back, and sometimes we look at things that happened after the end of the fiscal year if it's relevant to things that were going on during the fiscal year. But we can't audit 10 or 20 years back. We try to focus really on what's going on now. We started the field work in September 2012. We exited, meaning we actually presented our initial findings. Thank you. On August of 2013. We spent about 650 hours on this audit, which is pretty normal for a city of this size. We had estimated the cost would be between $50,000 and $65,000. They're coming in under that. We don't have a final number, but it'll probably be between $40,000 and $45,000 total. And we had a total of 5 findings. Now, a finding in an audit term is something that we found that needs to be corrected. Audits generally don't run through everything that's right about a place. We focus on the things that need some sort of changes or corrective action. And our audits, particularly petition audits, there's often a lot of emotion involved and people are very unhappy. We approach this in totally constructive manner. We're here not to call anybody to the mat or get mad at anybody or settle any sort of political scores. We're here simply to point out we did an audit of the city. We found some things that need improvement. We're hoping that they will be improved. We felt that the city was cooperative with our audit, and we're looking to see that those improvements occur. So what I'll do now is I'll go through the specific things we found and then open it up for questions. I put in a rating system when I became auditor. I thought it was important because sometimes we have very long audits that were mischaracterized for political purposes by the media or whatever, that we would put a rating on it. And we published very clearly how to get an excellent, how to get a good, how to get a fair, and how to get a poor. And it's on our website how you get that. We audited the city, and while we did find 2 or 3 things of serious concern, we actually gave it a good rating, because in a lot of areas we thought that the city was well run. And you should be proud of the city, because there were a lot of really good things that were going on. But I'll talk about the problems rather than the good things. But I wanted to say at the outset that we gave the city a good rating. Not the top rating, but not one of the lower ratings either. So basically what it means is the city is well managed with a few problems. And I'll go over what those problems are. But I want to put it in the context of the fact that we did find, as objective outside observers, that it is a well-run city. First was real estate acquisition and planning, and that was one of the main concerns of the petitioners, and there were some legitimate concerns there that were raised. In 2007, the city purchased 6.91 acres, as you know, for $791,000 for the future construction of a recreational facility. That's $114,000 per acre. It's a lot of money per acre. We found that the city had not first attained an appraisal for the land, and in order to finance the construction of the recreational facility, the voters would have needed to authorize a new tax, but as you know, the tax failed on 2 occasions, November 2008 and April 2012. There was no contingency plan developed, and there's no alternative means to finance the project. That's clearly a problem. If you're going to spend that kind of money on a small parcel of land, there needs to be an appraisal, and there needs to be future planning for what you're going to do with that land, and that did not happen. There was a second real estate transaction, which I'm sure you all are quite aware of, in 2006 when the Industrial Development Authority borrowed $908,000 to purchase 30 acres in a nearby city for industrial development. In order to get the IDA authority to get the loan, the city signed a 15-year, they called it a lease, which effectively guaranteed repayment of the loan by the city. But the city expected the Industrial Development Authority to use other monies to develop the property that would then make the lease payments unnecessary. After the purchase of the land, as I'm sure many of you here are aware, the IDA determined that the development would cost much more than originally planned, and the project was abandoned. The city has not utilized the property. There's no, at least as of the time we finished the audit, there was no plans for its future use. And the city had paid from January 2010 to June 2012 $172,000 from the general fund for this lease. If the city ends up having to pay back the entire amount of the lease, it'll be over $700,000. And then the IDA will own the property. The city and the authority are attempting to sell the property, but it's unclear what would happen to the lease payments if the property were sold. There would have to be some sort of secondary agreement. So we found that these two land transactions were highly problematic. Again, in the context of finding a lot of good things about the city, we found these two land transactions were highly problematic. We always make a recommendation when we have a finding. Our recommendation was that the Board of Aldermen should obtain appraisals for future real estate purchases, obviously. And the city agreed that additional planning would be beneficial and necessary. And for these long-term projects, this is not uncommon in cities of this size, that sometimes you get excited about a project and some of the necessary precautions taken in terms of appraisals and planning and long-term planning don't occur. We find that, actually, we found it in a number of cities that we've looked into. We are concerned that these properties will result in a big drain on the city's resources, and we hope that actions will be taken to prevent it going forward. Second finding we had is relative to health insurance procurement. The city's 2011 health insurance procurement was flawed. The city would not initially provide bidders with information about the past health histories of the people in the city who are under the plan. And of course, the existing company, which was affiliated with the ex-mayor, had all that data. And they didn't provide the information to the other bidders until just right before the close of the bidding. And that creates questions about the bidding process and whether it was fair, whether it was honest, and whether it was appropriate. Now, the former mayor did abstain from all discussions and decisions related to the selection of the health insurance, which is good, because there was clearly a conflict of interest there. But the city's conflict of interest policy is very clear. It says no officer or employee shall profit from any contract, sale, or service between the city and the person of the company. So that did occur here, and that is a violation. And the city did not adequately document the evaluation and selection process, so it's really unclear to us why the winning bid was chosen. As a result, we're recommending that all future vendors are given same opportunity, and there's formal competitive bidding processes, especially for big contracts like for health insurance, going forward. The city's response was they agree with the recommendation to establish a standardized selection methodology, but they believe that the 2011 process was fair and impartial. We don't actually agree with that. We think that the representation that it was fair is not consistent with the documentation we saw. It does appear that the other bidders were given the data they needed very late in the process, and that it was a flawed process. So we're asking for everything to be tightened up going forward. Our third finding relates to restricted funds. The city does not have adequate procedures to ensure that restricted monies are used only for their intended purposes. So, for example, on Parks and Recreation, the city assumed responsibility for supervision, maintenance, and care of all parks and recreation areas in exchange for a transfer from the general fund to the Parks Fund of about 95% of the money that they needed for park tax revenue to the general fund. Unfortunately, there's no separate accounting, though, so all that money goes in from the fund to the general fund, but there needs to be accounting to be sure that it's actually paid for and is being used for parks and recreation. And without separate accounting of park-related expenses from the general fund, the city can't really be sure how much money was spent on those issues. Now, there's a Missouri law, it's section 90.500, that requires parks tax revenues be utilized for establishment and maintenance of free public parks, and separate accounting for that is necessary to ensure compliance with that law, and that was not occurring when we did our audit. Capital improvement, the city used the capital improvement sales tax monies, which are restricted to recreational improvements and activities, to purchase a building, but part of that building's use is not recreational. So, for example, the building was purchased for $218,000, It stores grounds and maintenance equipment, and it houses grounds and maintenance offices. And then a lot of that is used for parks and recreational areas, but it's also used for other things. And that's why separate accounting is needed in order to make sure that restricted funds are properly used. Now, again, this is not an uncommon finding when we do audits of cities, that restricted and unrestricted funds are mixed, but it is against state law to do that, and we found the accounting here needs significant improvement. There was no analysis done to determine how much time is actually spent on parks versus other activities. Another finding we had was relative to law enforcement training. The city has not established a separate fund or accounting procedure to ensure law enforcement training receipts are expended only for law enforcement purposes. That is required by 2 Missouri statutes. And during fiscal year 2012, the city deposited about $11,800 in law enforcement training fees into the general fund. But during that time period, only about $7,000 was actually used for law enforcement purposes. So again, there needs to be much clearer accounting for restricted funds. Our recommendations are very specific. Determine if any park revenue monies remain in the general fund, and establish separate accounting of these monies. The city partially agreed with the finding, and we're concerned about a couple of issues that we raised in the audit, but our analysis make it very clear that there's commingling of those funds, and that commingling cannot continue. Next up, we had a number of other concerns that were raised by the petitioners that are not in the audit. You may be wondering what happened to that. I wanted to let you know we did look into those issues. So there was issues about the use of tourism funds to purchase property adjacent to the post office, about employment contracts. There was a fireworks purchase issue that we looked into. There was an issue relative to the neighborhood stabilization program, tracking hours and materials. I will tell you that we appreciate these things being brought to our attention, and we found some minor discrepancies which we've addressed, but we did not find anything really serious in those areas. And in most cases, it passed our audit test. So that's a summary of what we found. I hope you'll read the audit more carefully, because when I do an audit delivery, I really only summarize. The really big issue for you all was the land transactions. That's a lot of money. The money was not well planned for and not well accounted for, and we hope that will be improved. But I will tell you, when I do petitions, we usually find more wrong than we found here. So it's a mixed bag, okay? I don't think there were a lot of problems, and I'll be frank with you. Usually when I go in, I have an audit that's this thick, and not 5 findings, but 20 or 25 findings when there's a petition. So I will hope that the people here who represent the city will take swift corrective action to correct the real problems that we did find, particularly with the land transaction and the commingling of assets. But otherwise, we think you have a pretty well-run city. I'm happy to answer any questions you have. Thanks. Yes?
One question about the appraisal. Was there any talk of doing an appraisal before they bought the land?
We're not aware of any. We did not find any evidence to that effect. Is that correct, Bob? Yeah, we did not find any talk of an appraisal. And that's $114,000 an acre. You've hit on the real issue that we found. That's a lot of money. I'm not an expert in land valuation. We own a little land in rural Missouri. We didn't pay $114,000 per acre for it. But what I do know as an auditor, we're not experts in real estate. As an auditor, we do look at requirements for land purchase under state law, local ordinances, and you always get an appraisal.
And the $791 was a cash payment, correct?
I'm not sure. Bobby, was that a cash payment? Do you know? No? What's that? It was a check, which sort of is cash. Yeah.
It was cash.
Effectively cash, yes.
It didn't go through a bank.
Right, but it wasn't actual cash, but it was a check, correct. Yes?
My only question is, I understand the need for the audit, the appraisal. You repeatedly say, it's a lot of money, That would imply that they paid beyond the market value. Did you look into the purchase price of like properties back then?
No. And the reason why is simple. We are auditors, not real estate people. And so we confine ourselves to what an audit objective is under state law. And for example, if I go into the Department of Mental Health and do an audit, which we do every 2 or 3 years, I don't judge whether they're curing people of their mental health problems. I look to see if they're following laws and regulations and standard business practices in that agency. So for example, we found that they had way too much overtime, but that doesn't relate to correcting mental health. In this particular case, one thing we know, and standard practice across the state and sometimes required by law, before you make a big real estate you get an appraisal. But we weren't going to go into, well, how much should they have paid or whether they, and start being a realtor. That we weren't going to do.
And I guess what I'm getting at is, you've said a couple times that's a lot of money, and you said it's $114,000 an acre, which certainly isn't in my price range. But you're not the same criticism would be there whether they paid $114,000 an acre or $5,000 an acre. How much they paid isn't really the issue, correct?
It's correct, except that the more money you pay, the more obvious it is you needed an appraisal. You know what I'm saying? I mean, yeah, a city this big, for a city of this size, $800,000 is a lot of money. And so you'd think they'd get an appraisal. I would want an appraisal for a $20,000 real estate transaction. That's true. But when you start talking about this kind of money and this amount per acre, it emphasizes the need to have an appraisal.
Okay.
Other questions? No?
I have a
Well,
question.
yes.
How many years back did you look at the insurance, on the health insurance? Because I was a former employee and paid for my family, and obviously it sounds like I may or may not have got the best deal. So how many years back?
Well, the audit period was only for fiscal year 2012. We did look a little bit back just for comparative purpose, but it was mostly a one-year period because we'd be here forever if we audited 6 or 8 years back, and we didn't want to do that. It would cost the city too much money. What we know is that this particular procurement that occurred most recently was flawed. Other questions? Look, it's an honor to serve as your state auditor. There's nothing I enjoy more than coming out and talking to people. I'm happy to talk to any media that's here afterwards and talk to you. I'll stick around for a few minutes, and if you just want to talk to me privately for a couple of minutes, I'm happy to do it. I'd also like to meet the people who run the city. I will tell you that most of my petition audits turn out worse than this. So I know you all are concerned, and some of you are unhappy with what went on, and there clearly were problems. I just pointed them out. But you got a pretty good city here, and you should be happy about that. Thank you.